With the ever-changing world of AI and data modeling constantly evolving these days, there's a really big question that people need to ask themselves. How up to date are you with the principles of data privacy? Well, that's what we're going to be looking into this week on the Data Radio Show. Hello there, and welcome to this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. I'm your host, Paul. This week, we're going to be taking a listen to a podcast around the privacy issues that come with dealing with data, and there's so many of them. In fact, what we've done is we've taken a whole bunch of information from a course that we offer on our school page around data privacy principles, and we've run that through Notebook LM to create a podcast that's a bit of a study guide for people who might be wanting an overview on this. And of course, if you want to do a bit more of a deep dive, head over to our school channel. It's linked in the description below, and take the course. It's free. You just have to sign up to the page. It's right there and super easy to find. There's a lot that gets covered in there. And so this is a really succinct way to take a look at an overview of it all. So it'll be a nice, easy listen for you. So turn the volume up, grab a drink, maybe do the dishes or something while you're listening to it. So let's jump over there. But before we do, make sure that you have hit that subscribe button so that you're getting updates from us. We're actually in the process of doing a bit of a revamp on the channel, so we'll announce a little bit more about that coming up soon. On top of that, feel free to like the video as well, because that's always a good thing to feed to the algorithm. All right, let's jump over now and listen to this Notebook LM conversation around the principles of data privacy.
Okay, let's get into this. I mean, we are just surrounded by data, aren't we?
Absolutely swimming in it.
Every click, every interaction, sensor readings, it all adds up to this huge wave. And honestly, sometimes trying to make sense of it feels like, well, drinking from a fire hose.
It really can. And, as that volume and complexity just explode, figuring out how it's handled responsibly, especially personal information,
Right.
that becomes more than just important. It's fundamental for trust, for compliance.
Exactly. That feeling of overload is real, especially when you look at all the different data privacy rules popping up everywhere. It gets complex fast.
Yeah.
Which is why we wanted to do this deep dive today, to sort of cut through that complexity a bit.
Yeah.
And really get to the core ideas, the ones guiding how we handle personal data.
Mm-hmm.
And our source material for this is this really excellent series by an Australian data privacy expert, Richard Harris. He does a great job breaking down these fundamental concepts.
Yeah, his work is great. It really boils down years of regulations into principles you can actually work with.
And that's our mission here, right? To unpack those fundamental principles, the ones that underpin data privacy rules all over the world. So by understanding these core ideas, you get a clearer picture of what's expected when you're dealing with personal data. Doesn't matter which specific regulation you're looking at. Think of it like a privacy principle decoder ring.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And critically, this isn't just theory, not just for the lawyers or compliance folks. For you as a data professional, actually understanding this landscape, applying these principles, it's becoming an essential skill. It really is where the field is moving.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's jump in. Before we even get to the principles themselves, we have to nail down the basics. Like, what is personal data exactly?
Right. So at its heart, it's information that relates to an identified or identifiable individual. Now, that phrase, identifiable individual, that's where it gets interesting because it's meant to be pretty broad.
Right. So it's not just the obvious stuff we used to call PII, like name, address, phone number.
Correct. It goes way beyond that. It includes things like an IP address, maybe device IDs, persistent cookies. Individually, they might not shout your name, but they can still point to a specific person over time. Or, when combined with other bits of information.
And that combination aspect is really interesting and maybe sometimes overlooked. It's also about combinations of data points that when you put them together can uniquely identify someone. The source gives a great example. Knowing someone's surname, date of birth, and postcode or zip code, that significantly bumps up the chance of identification, especially if you cross-reference it with, say, public data sources.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that any other data elements that are linked to that now identified identity, they also become personal information. Your purchase history, browsing habits, location data, if it's tied back to you, it counts as personal data. And this definition, it keeps expanding, right? Because technology lets us link data in new ways all the time.
Which is exactly why the regulations define it broadly. So that as new tech emerges, new ways to identify people, they automatically fall under the definition. So for you building systems, you have to ask, do I have identity information here? Or can I combine information to identify someone? If the answer is yes, then okay, that project definitely involves personal data.
And you should think pretty critically about what that means for the scope, for the definition of personal information within your specific project.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So beyond that broad category, is there data that needs even more careful handling?
Yes, absolutely. There's a subset. It's often called sensitive information or sometimes special categories of data, depending on the specific regulation. This stuff requires a much higher level of protection. Why? Because the potential harm from its misuse or, a breach is significantly higher. We're talking about things like health information, genetic data, biometric data, financial details, also race, ethnicity, political opinion, sexual orientation, things like that.
Okay, so personal data is broad, it's expanding, and sensitive data is this critical subset needing extra caution.
Got it. Now let's get to those principles. The source material highlights 9 core principles that seem to show up maybe in different forms, but across most major regulations globally. Why focus on principles instead of just trying to memorize every single law? That sounds impossible.
It practically is. The sheer number of regulations, GDPR in Europe, the APPs in Australia, CCPA in California, PIPEDA in Canada, plus countless others popping up all the time. No one person can be an expert in the tiny details of all of them, but these regulations, they largely follow the same core principles. Understanding the principles gives you the framework, the kind of underlying philosophy that lets you quickly grasp the intent and the requirements of any privacy law you come across.
So it's like the universal translator for data privacy. That's a perfect way to think about it. It's about understanding the DNA of privacy compliance, not just memorizing every dialect it's spoken in. Exactly. And applying these principles, it's not just about ticking boxes on a compliance checklist. It's the foundation for building real trust with individuals, with organizations. It's how you genuinely bake privacy by design into your projects right from the start.
Okay, let's dive into these 9 then. First one up, transparency.
Right. Principle 1. This is fundamental. Managing personal information openly and transparently. This means we have a clear obligation, really, to inform individuals about how their data is being used, who exactly is using it, internal teams, external third parties, and for what specific defined purposes.
That feels like something everyone would want for their own data.
Yeah.
Right? Just basic fairness. But how detailed does this transparency need to be in practice?
It needs to be genuinely understandable, not just legally correct, but clear. It means having a privacy policy that's clearly expressed, easy to find, and kept up to date. But just having a policy isn't enough. When someone looks at it or when you collect data from them, they need to truly get what happens to their information, how it's used, why it's used, who gets access, how you're protecting it. Using complex legal jargon or, burying key details deep in the text, it just defeats the whole purpose.
So, for a project, you need to ask, is the way we plan to use this personal info clearly spelled out in our public policy? And in a way a regular person can actually understand. The source mentions using data for things like AI training. If that specific use isn't transparently disclosed, you're probably breaching this principle.
Right. And closely linked to that is making sure you actually have a legal basis or authority for using that data in the first place. Is there a justification under the rules? Like, did you get informed consent? Or is the use so directly related to the original purpose that there's a clear expectation? That's definitely a question you need to involve your legal and risk teams on. No doubt.
Okay. Principle number 2.
Yeah.
Purpose limitation.
Yeah. This one's designed to stop that collect everything, use for anything later mindset, which used to be pretty common. It states very clearly you can only use, collect, or process data for the specific purpose it was originally collected for, unless you get additional explicit consent for a new purpose.
Gotcha. So if I collect your shipping address just to send you a package, I can't then just decide to use that same address to send you, say, marketing mailers from partners, not without getting your specific okay for that new use.
Precisely. It's about giving individuals control, certainty, over how their data gets used after that first interaction. You should only collect information where it's genuinely necessary for your stated, understood business practices. And if it's sensitive information we talked about earlier, you generally need explicit consent right from the start, though some laws do have very limited exceptions.
Does how you collected it matter here as well?
Oh, absolutely. Collection should always be through lawful and fair means. This loops back to transparency, right? Ensuring people provided the information voluntarily with informed consent about the purpose. Ideally, data comes directly from the individual rather than being acquired through, let's say, less transparent ways.
You mentioned consent again. What kind do we talk about? The source mentions explicit versus implied.
Right. Explicit consent is really the gold standard here. That's someone actively ticking a box or maybe verbally agreeing or signing something that clearly says, yes, I agree to this specific purpose. Implied consent is much weaker. That's where maybe you've informed them generally through a policy, but they haven't actively agreed to that particular use. Now, implied consent might sometimes be okay for non-sensitive data and really closely related purposes, but explicit consent is strongly preferred, especially for sensitive data or for uses that go beyond that initial interaction. So when building solutions, the questions are critical. What was the original purpose here? Do we have consent for this new use we're thinking about? If not, do we need to go back and get new explicit consent?
Makes sense. Okay, principle number 3, data minimization. This one sounds like a core technical design principle, but also maybe one where things often go wrong.
It is absolutely critical, yes. And you're right, failures here are often why data breaches end up being so damaging. The principle itself is simple but powerful. Collect and keep only the minimum amount of personal data that's necessary for the specific purpose you identified. This directly reduces your attack surface, and it significantly limits the harm to individuals if, heaven forbid, there is a breach.
The source gives that really stark example, the health fund breach in Australia.
Yes, that was a huge one. Over 9 million customer records breached. And the really painful part, a massive chunk of that data belonged to former customers, information that was no longer needed for any ongoing purpose. It should have been deleted or properly de-identified ages ago. The sheer scale of that breach was multiplied because the organization simply wasn't practicing data minimization. The core insight here, often your absolute best defense against breaches is holding on to less data. If you don't need it anymore, deleting it or de-identifying it is like your superpower.
So it's not just about what you collect up front, but also about what you hold on to over time, that lifecycle management.
Exactly. A key part of your data architecture, your data governance, should be proactively figuring out when data is no longer necessary. Maybe because it's out of date or inaccurate or the original purpose for that specific record just isn't relevant anymore.
And then
Just get rid of it.
you build processes to dispose of it securely. That means either deleting the information outright or properly de-identifying it. De-identification, if you do it right so it cannot be re-identified, that's often a great way to comply because most regulations say once data is truly de-identified, it's no longer covered by the Privacy Act. But there are strict rules on how to de-identify effectively. It's not always simple.
It sounds straightforward. Collect less, delete more. But isn't there sometimes a tension between data minimization and, say, needing robust historical data sets for things like analytics, AI training, maybe even compliance auditing? How do you balance that? That's a fantastic point. And it gets to the nuance, doesn't it? Minimization isn't about keeping zero data. It's about keeping the minimum necessary for a legitimate purpose. So for AI training, okay, the purpose is analytics. Can you achieve that purpose using de-identified data? Or maybe aggregate data? Or perhaps just a smaller subset? Can you retain it only as long as the training is actually needed? Or for auditing, maybe you keep only the specific transaction records legally required, and only for the legally set period. It really requires careful analysis of the true purpose, and then finding the least data-intensive way to achieve it. It means asking, how is this data actually going to be used for this purpose? When is it no longer necessary for that purpose? And what's the automated plan for disposal or de-identification that's built into the system?
Building those disposal processes in from day one. Wow, that sounds like it would save huge headaches and probably costs later on, especially as regulators get tougher on enforcing retention limits.
It absolutely does. It's proactive, pays dividends in risk reduction down the line.
Okay, principle number 4, data integrity and accuracy. This feels like standard data management practice, right? But how does it specifically fit into privacy?
It absolutely should be standard practice. You're right. This principle says data should be accurate, complete, up to date, and protected against unauthorized changes or loss. While that's crucial for data quality in general, it's a vital privacy principle because decisions are often made about individuals based on this data. If the data is wrong, the decisions made about you could be wrong, and that can lead to real harm. You need to be able to trust the information to produce trustworthy results, especially for the individuals involved. The key insight here, I think, is bad data doesn't just break your reports. It can cause actual harm to people.
So even if you're already focused on data quality, you need to view it through a privacy lens too, asking, where did this data come from? How do we ensure its accuracy for the specific purposes it's being used for? When was it last updated? And what automated quality checks or validation processes are applied before it's used to make decisions or shared somewhere else?
Exactly. Ensuring the information used is reliable is part of that fundamental obligation you have to the individual whose data it is.
Principle 5, security. Another one that seems like standard IT practice. What's the specific privacy angle here?
Well, data security is obviously paramount for protecting personal information, from unauthorized access, loss, disclosure, all that bad stuff. And while technical cybersecurity measures firewalls, encryption are essential, the source rightly points out that a huge percentage of data incidents trace back to human error or failures in internal processes. So, you need robust technical and organizational security measures. Both are critical for privacy.
Organizational measures. Like what? Policies and training.
Yes. Having clear policies around data handling, making sure they're actually followed, providing regular training to staff, that's non-negotiable. This also circles back to minimization, remember. One really powerful way to protect data is just not to have it in the first place, but also architecting solutions so that only those individuals with a genuine justified need based on their role can actually access personal information. Think about who really needs to see full names and addresses versus who just needs, say, aggregated demographic data or maybe an anonymous user ID for their analytics work.
Right. So you need to ask, who needs access to this specific personal data? How do we control that access granularly? Can we use techniques like anonymization, pseudonymization, or maybe attribute-based access controls to limit what people see based purely on their need to know? The key insight seems to be, security isn't just about keeping intruders out. It's just as much about managing who gets to see what inside the system, too.
Precisely. Don't just rely on the tech firewalls. Robust policies around access reviews, using multi-factor authentication for internal systems, strong password requirements, they're all just as essential.
Okay, principle 6, consent. We touched on this with purpose limitation, but sounds like it's important enough to be its own principle.
It really is. Consent is a cornerstone because most places now require some form of valid consent before you can even collect, process, or share personal information, especially for uses that aren't strictly essential or for that sensitive data we talked about.
And you mentioned earlier it needs to be specific and informed.
Absolutely. Most regulations are pretty clear that consent needs to be specific. Specific to a particular purpose, or maybe a set of very closely related purposes. Just presenting someone with a long, vague list of everything you might possibly do with their data someday, that's generally not specific enough. You need to say clearly, we are collecting your information for this specific purpose, and ideally, get separate consent for different unrelated uses. It also must be informed. You have to tell them. And critically, tell them in a way they can actually understand. The source highlights that problem with super long, complex privacy policies that, let's be honest, no normal human can realistically read or understand. That undermines the whole idea of informed consent. Consent also has to be freely given, not forced or coerced. And importantly, you have to be able to demonstrate how and when you got that valid consent. You need proof.
And here's a crucial point. Can someone change their mind later?
Yes. In many, many jurisdictions, consent can be withdrawn at any time. This is a really key design consideration for any system handling personal data. If someone withdraws consent for a specific use, say, they don't want direct marketing emails anymore, how did your system actually remove their info from that process or platform? Or at least flag it so it's excluded? That can be a significant technical challenge, especially in older systems. The key insight, I think, is consent isn't just a one-time checkbox you tick at the beginning. It's more like an ongoing relationship. And managing withdrawal is just as important as getting the consent in the first place.
That's a critical question for system design then. Do we actually have consent for this use? How do we get it? How do we limit use only to what that consent allows? And maybe most importantly, how do we technically handle it if someone withdraws that consent?
Exactly right. Those are the questions.
Principle 7, data subject rights. This sounds like giving individuals some agency over their own data.
It is exactly that. This principle flows from the fundamental idea that privacy is a human right, and that the personal information someone gives you doesn't suddenly become your unrestricted property to do whatever you want with. It essentially stays under their control, in a sense. So as you build solutions, you absolutely need to plan for when someone decides to exercise these rights.
What are some of the most common rights an individual might have?
Well, there are several common ones you see across different regulations. The right to access is a big one. An individual can ask you what personal information you hold about them. And that's not just name and address. It could be online tracking data, purchase history, customer service notes, even inferred data like interests you've assigned them. You're often obliged to provide them with a copy of that information.
And what if they look at it and find something's wrong?
Ah, that's the right of rectification or correction. If they spot inaccuracies, they have the right to demand that you fix it. Then there's the one that gets a lot of discussion, the right to erasure, often called the right to be forgotten.
That one sounds tricky, especially since you just talked about data minimization, suggesting we should be deleting data we don't need anyway. Isn't erasure hard to implement?
It can be complex, yes. Erasure might involve de-identification rather than literal deletion, especially if the data is tangled up in complex or historical systems. Also, there are often legitimate legal or business reasons why you can't delete certain data. Think about financial transaction records you have to keep for tax or audit purposes for a set number of years. So these exclusions exist. But the general principle is you comply with the request wherever possible. Other common rights include the right to restrict the processing, maybe stop using their information for a specific purpose, the right to data portability, getting their data in a structured format, maybe to take it to another provider, and the right to object to certain types of processing altogether, which might require you to stop until the issue is resolved. The key insight here, individuals aren't just passive sources of data anymore. They have fundamental rights that you must be able to support operationally.
So for your projects, you need to figure out which data subject rights apply based on the regulations relevant to the data you're handling. You need to ensure your incident response plan or your service request process actually includes handling these requests properly. And crucially, design your systems from the very beginning to technically support these actions. Like, how would you actually execute an erasure request?
Absolutely crucial. Thinking about how you'd handle a right to be forgotten request before you design your main data store, that will save you immense pain later on, believe me.
Okay. Principle 8, international transfers. Data moving across borders. This sounds important in our globalized world.
It is, very. This principle addresses the genuine concerns governments and regulators have about where their citizens' data ends up, where it's sent, stored, processed, particularly regarding security standards in other countries, potential access by foreign governments, or maybe just different privacy rules altogether. So, if you transfer data outside the country or jurisdiction where you collected it, you have to ensure it still receives an adequate level of protection, comparable to the protection it had in the original location.
How do organizations typically ensure that protection when data goes overseas?
Well, many governments or regulatory bodies keep lists of countries they consider to have adequate or similar levels of data protection. Transfers to those approved locations are generally okay. If you're sending data somewhere without those equivalent protections, then you need to put extra measures in place. This often involves things like standard contractual clauses, agreements with the recipient guaranteeing how they'll manage and protect the data, or maybe binding corporate rules if it's within a multinational company. And you also need ways to actually monitor compliance with those measures, the key insight. Data privacy laws tend to follow the data, not just your company's headquarters address.
Got it. So questions to ask for your projects. Where is this data actually going to be stored? Will any overseas systems or third parties access or process it? What are the data protection standards like in those locations? And what contractual or technical safeguards do we have in place to make sure it's adequately protected?
Correct. It's all about ensuring the data's privacy isn't weakened just because it crossed a border, which happens all the time now with cloud services and global systems.
Right. And finally, principle 9, accountability. This feels like the show your work principle that ties everything else together.
It absolutely is. That's a great way to put it. Accountability is your ability to take responsibility for complying with all the other principles we've just talked about. And crucially, being able to demonstrate how you comply to regulators, to auditors, maybe to the individuals affected.
How do organizations usually demonstrate that accountability? What does that look like?
Typically, by having documented policies, procedures, and operational mechanisms clearly in place, and importantly, actively followed. This includes things like appointing a data protection officer if required, actively using privacy by design methods during project development, conducting data protection impact assessments or privacy impact assessments, DPIAs or PIAs, especially for higher risk activities. It also means keeping detailed records about your data flows and processing activities and providing regular privacy training and awareness for staff. The key insight here, forget just trust us. Regulators increasingly demand show us the proof.
And is this often where organizations fall short when something goes wrong, like a breach?
Exactly. When a complaint comes in, or a data subject tries to exercise a right, or especially when a breach happens, the government, the regulators, they come asking to see your documentation. They want to understand your processes. If the answer is, oh, we can't find it, or it's not really written down, or, well, we just try our best,
Yeah.
That's a massive issue, and it can lead to significant penalties. Many laws now have very specific, explicit requirements for demonstrating this accountability.
So more questions for your projects. Are we actually following our internal privacy policies and procedures? Are those procedures clearly documented somewhere? Have we done a PIA for this project? Have we mapped out our data flows so we understand where personal data is going? Can we prove we did all of this if someone asks?
Spot on. Accountability really underpins everything else. It requires you to formalize your practices and prove they weren't just, wishful thinking.
Wow. Okay, so just to quickly recap those 9 core principles that act as our universal translator for data privacy. We had transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, data integrity and accuracy, security, consent, data subject rights, international transfers, and accountability.
Understanding those really does give you that solid foundation, that framework for navigating this complex world of data privacy regulations, no matter which specific law happens to apply to the data you're working with.
And as data professionals, applying these principles right from the start, that is the definition of privacy by design, isn't it? It's moving beyond just meeting compliance checklists to proactively building systems that respect privacy, that build trust, and fundamentally that reduce risk. The source material makes a really good point that there's a genuine skill shortage out there for data professionals who also really get privacy and know how to apply it practically.
And that's exactly where your value goes up exponentially. Organizations are increasingly recognizing the huge responsibility that comes with handling personal information. They desperately need people who can make sure data isn't just accurate and useful, but is also handled safely, ethically, and compliantly by applying these very principles we've been discussing.
This deep dive has definitely covered a lot of ground. From really getting clear on what personal data is, especially that identifiable part, to exploring those 9 core principles that guide responsible data handling around the globe. Understanding them genuinely gives you that decoder ring for all the different privacy regulations out there.
And it powerfully reinforces the critical role that data professionals like you play in implementing privacy by design, taking these principles off the page and making them real in the systems and processes you build every single day.
And, as technology just keeps racing ahead, the very concept of what might fall under privacy regulations is also expanding. The source mentioned recent discussions, potential updates even, to include things like neural data as personal information,
Yeah.
derived from devices that can, scan brainwave activities or maybe even interpret emotional states from data.
Which dramatically highlights the ongoing need to apply these foundational privacy principles like minimization, consent, security, purpose limitation, not just to the data we're used to, but to these emerging technologies and new data types as they come online. The principles themselves remain relevant, but the application, that gets more complex. It requires really critical thinking.
Absolutely. So maybe here's a final thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive. How will you actively integrate these fundamental data privacy principles into the next data project you encounter? Especially as we see these increasingly sensitive and personal data types like neural data potentially becoming part of the privacy landscape. How will you make sure these principles are not just buzzwords, but they become practical design choices in your work?
Hey, I want to thank Richard Harris. He's the person who put together the course that we've got on the school page around data privacy that we've used for this particular episode. There's some really fascinating stuff there. Richard is an absolute expert on this topic, so if you're looking for some courses or anything like that to take your team through, he's definitely the person to reach out to if you're in Australia. He's absolutely brilliant with that kind of stuff, and you can find him as well on that school community. He's there checking stuff out all the time. All right, until next time, look after yourself, live long, prosper, be one with the force, hit that subscribe button or like the video, or feel free to share it as well. So you got options. We like options. All right, until next time, catch you later.